cattle industry brought millions of dollars to the West during the mid to late 1800s. Cheap Western cattle could be sold in other areas at a higher price, but the issue was getting the cattle to market. This is where the Cowboys came in. The Cowboys were leaders of the cattle that drove them to market. This process was called a cattle drive. In 1867, Joseph McCoy created a path called the Chisholm Trail that tracked from Texas to Kansas. This trail is where cowboys would drive as many as 1,500 cattle. Cattle would be sold at railroad towns, and the cowboys would return back to Texas. True or false? American cowboys invented cattle raising. This is actually false. It's a common misconception. Cattle raising actually originated from Mexican cowboys called vaqueros. American cowboys simply learned the tricks of the trade from these Mexican cowboys. The Texans realized the potential of this way of life and utilized its practices. Another common misconception about cowboys is that they're skilled marksmen. In reality, cowboys use the lasso more than use the gun to wrangle the cattle. How about another true or false? True or false? All cowboys were white. If you answered false, then you are correct. About a quarter of the West cowboys were male African Americans, and even more of them were Mexican. This is considering the fact that the cowboy ways were learned from the Mexicans. Yet another common misconception is that cowboys were tall, burly men. This description has been distorted and heightened throughout history because it is far from the truth. In reality, cowboys were usually smaller in stature to avoid strain on the horse.
Cowboys were typically young, being in their early 20s. All backgrounds were able to become a cowboy, including blacks, whites, Mexicans, and Indians. They protected the wild cattle, keeping the giant herds together and at peace. Many came for their own reasons, some looking for money, others being old war veterans, and some immigrants. Cowboys faced many dangers: attacks from Indians, stampedes, diseases and accidents. Sickness or injury most certainly meant death, cowboys not exactly having proper medical treatment at the time. Their workdays lasted 15 hours, much of which was spent in the saddle. Occasionally shots were fired by hostile Indians or farmers. Cattle rustlers sometimes stole their steers, and one of the greatest fears of the cowboy was a stampede, which could result in death or loss of cattle, or even the cowboy themselves. One method of containing a stampede was to get the cattle to run in a circle where the steer would eventually tire. Texas was the origin of the entire cowboy myth. By Civil War's end, cattle roamed freely throughout the state. Cowboys were born from the need to herd cattle and do something with them other than let them roam the countryside. The cowboy industry would begin in 1866 and end 20 years later in 1886. Ranching became the new frontier. They bred cattle and created heftier, more meaty animals, keeping them in smaller herds. This caused them to become easier to manage and protect. They fenced the herds in and kept them, ranching solidifying the need for cowboys. It made the job official, it no longer being a side task or hobby. By the early 1870s, rail lines reached Texas, so the cattle could be shipped directly to the slaughterhouses. Ranchers continued to allow their cattle to graze by the rails, but this was quickly ended by the invention of barbed wire. It ruined the open fields and left cowboys out of business. The cheap wire marked the territory to keep the unwanted steers off their land and keep their own cattle in. Overproduction caused prices to fall, leaving many ranchers out of business.
A cowboy's equipment. The clothes of a cowboy inspired envy in Americans all around the United States. The hats of a cowboy were crowned with big floppy rims used for protection from the sun. It could also be useful for scooping up water or folded over as a pillow. The bandana handkerchief tied around the neck could be used as a cover from dirt and dust. Originally, the collarless shirt and pants were also made of flannel or sometimes wood. A vest was normally given to protect cowboys from cold winds, and it had a number of useful pockets. The boots with heels 2 inches high were used in stirrups or to dig in the ground while roping a calf. They were absolutely practical for that time. The stock saddle's design traced all the way back to the Moors of North Africa, having some American cowboy by way of Spanish and Mexicans. Chaps served a valuable purpose when the cowboy had to chase after a steer into a patch of thorny mesquite. A bridle were normally involved when calves had to be driven out. And to top it all off, a well-balanced six-shooter completed the cowboy's outfit.
There were about 5 million longhorn cattle in Texas in 1865, and there was a market for them up in the north. Beef had a high price there, $4 in Texas and $40 in the north. That's 10 times what they were in the south. Also, the invention of refrigerated rail carriages allowed the transportation of slaughtered cattle. Native Americans were removed from the plains to allow more land to be available for ranches. There we go. Ranchers had large herds which led to overpopulation and overgrazing. Cattle trade was at its peak from 1867 until the early 1880s. The demand for beef fell and it became less profitable. The loss of grazing land and summer droughts decimated the cattle herds on the Great Plains. The trading of beef essentially collapsed when farmers began to artificially select different breeds of cattle that could not live on the open range. People stopped using open ranches and instead kept their cattle on smaller ranches and in smaller quantities. The invention of barbed wire by J.F. Glyden in 1874 meant that large areas could be fenced cheaply. The invention of the wind pump meant that water could be pumped directly to the ranches and they did not need to be located near a river or a stream, and this made the smaller ranches more popular. Fewer cowboys were needed and the industry fell.